Hello there, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today we're going to look at British Islam. Is it a thing? What is it? What are the problems with it? It's a really controversial idea. We'll go into that a little bit. But I'm very honored, and it's a great pleasure to talk to Dr. Haroon Sidat, who is an academic at the University of Cardiff, which is in Wales, where he completed a PhD about the training of British Muslim scholars in the UK. He's also an imam at a mosque in Lancashire, up north, as we say, down here in London. And he continues to teach courses in Islamic traditional sciences in the areas of Islamic law, theology, and also teaches around British Muslim concerns in the modern world in Islamic law in Britain and so on. So you are most welcome, Haroon. Welcome to Blogging Theology.
Thank you, Paul, for having me.
And your work also, your academic work is researching into understanding British imams. And there's a research project going on at Cardiff University's Centre for the Study of Islam in the UK. Could you just explain a little bit about what you're doing with that and what that's a purpose of that is?
Yeah, so with a few colleagues, we're working on a long-term project, 3 years. We're actually entering in we're into the final year of the project now, which basically means we're going to be writing up our findings and hopefully, God willing, at the end of the project, making them publicly available. Hopefully having a monograph, some published papers, presentations, and also on the back of our findings, talking to organizations that are involved with the training of imams in terms of our findings and how they can help imams serve Muslim communities, but also British society more broadly as well, because what we found is imams also serve not just the direct community, which is their congregants, but also many imams are heavily involved in serving people who are non-Muslims in various ways as well. But the project, if I can go back to the project itself, the project came on the back of my PhD, which looked at seminaries in Britain.
So what is a seminary? So I can ask an idiot's question here. What is an imam? Is it like a priest? Is it like a Catholic priest? Is it like a vicar in the local church? What is a seminary? Is that where you train Muslim scholars or imams? So just to really make it clear what we're talking about.
Excellent. So the first question, there is a chapter I hope to write in the book which looks at, are imams priests and are they the same thing? I think it's a useful shorthand for people to appreciate who an imam may be, but I do think there are differences. I do think their roles are differences. Primarily, the imam is the one that leads the prayer, the 5 times daily prayer that Muslims pray in the mosque or when they attend the mosque as well. So that's the primary role of an imam. Of course, alongside that, they'll have a lot of other roles, which is to deliver sermons on a Friday, provide pastoral care to their community, etc., etc. So it can vary across the country, but the core would be to lead the 5 times daily prayer. That's the role of an imam.
So they provide. There is an overlap then with priests in that priests normally provide pastoral care, to some kind of leadership role as well, and they lead the prayer obviously in church. That they would, but priests have a kind of sacrificial role. They're kind of really fundamental to the religion itself, and that's not the case in Islam, is it? The imams are prayer leaders, and anyone can. Sunni Islam, anyone can lead the prayer in theory, as long as they are, persons of repute. They don't have to be clerical or anything like that.
Yeah, it's much more flexible, if you like. If you look at the books of law, when they stipulate the conditions for an imam, they do have gradations in terms of who can become an imam. Things around the one who recites the Quran the most eloquently, the most beautifully, and so forth and so on. So, I mean, you could be traveling and, your friend could just lead the prayer, and it's fine. It's not an issue as such, because the main thing is the prayer needs to be done. And so that's done in congregation. So the imam has that primary role. In terms of a seminary, now seminary is a shorthand again for what we call al-Uloom. Al-Uloom is an Arabic word. It's also been used in the South Asian tradition, which is Persian and Urdu speaking. And the al-Uloom literally means house of knowledge. Dar, house, Uloom, sciences, house of sciences. And so we have quite a few in the UK. They emerge primarily in the subcontinent, and they came. I mean, they were set up here in the UK. The first one was in Greater Manchester,
This means
Bury.
subcontinent. I know this is shorthand, but what does subcontinent mean in terms of a British?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah, Paul. That means basically. Sorry, thank you. That basically means India. What was
India?
What was the whole of India?
Whole of India.
Pre-partition.
Right.
Yeah, pre-partition. So all of that sort of landmass, if you like, there.
Pakistan then as well, then presumably.
Pakistan, all of that would have been, broadly speaking, they would call that a subcontinent. So yeah. So there was a tradition that emerged there post the mutiny in 1857, and a seminary evolved and was established in India in a place called Deoband, which is sort of like North India, if you like, on the map. And it quickly grew, and with Muslims coming to Britain in the 60s, 70s, this particular tradition, what's called a Deobandi tradition, because the town that the seminary was set up was called Deoband, so it was called a Deoband.
So it's named after the name of the town. It's not some kind of technical Islamic term for. Okay.
Yeah. It's not like it's not Islamic. It's not Islamic. I mean, again, we can go into this conversation around naming things, right? I mean, it's named after the place that it was set up.
It's named after the place. So that I didn't actually know that. That's helpful. I thought it must be some obscure thing, but no, it's just the name of the place.
Yeah.
But of course, the Taliban, without going into all this, and this is a real diversion, but the Taliban are also associated with the Deobandi movement.
Yeah, so there are people who would make the claim. Although Deoband the seminary itself has publicly condemned their actions and movements within them. So we can go into all of that maybe in a separate video. But
because it can make people think, oh, that's a Taliban. They're that. But as you say, the main seminary have condemned their excesses and their crimes.
Yeah, you can find the fatwa publicly available, which talk about that. And so the seminaries were set up. The first one was in Bury, which is in Greater Manchester, a small town, village maybe even, which was the first seminary, which sort of migrated here, and then they grew very, very quickly as a Muslim population began to increase, and their demand for mosque leaders, imams, and religious leaders began to increase. And so they were very, very early on engaged in education, because they realized the Deobandi tradition, or Deobandi scholars and followers of that tradition quickly realized that they needed to provide the next generation of leaders who were from Britain, who were born and bred in Britain.
Which, of course, just interrupt her. You are born and bred in Britain. I mean, I happen to know that.
Yeah.
You're from Lancashire, I believe, which is up north, as I keep on saying. And but you also speak Urdu, is that right? You're fluent in Urdu.
I speak Urdu, yeah. Gujarati is my language that my parents taught me, and they speak as well.
Right.
And I'm learning. I mean, I can speak Persian, but I'm learning Persian as well as a language as well.
And also, you can read Arabic, because
I can read Arabic. My French has become very, very rusty. I probably need to spend some time in France.
Did you know that's I found I spent a lot of time in France. That's the only way to learn French, is to be immersed in it like a goldfish in a bowl. You got just learning. The odd phrase here at school is just a waste of time, in my humble opinion. You've got to be there and just pick it up. Anyway, that's a different subject. Well, that's absolutely fascinating. So you're a British Muslim, you're an academic, you're a scholar, you're an imam, you're a father, you have many facets to your extraordinary life. So, but this whole idea of British Islam, now, when I flagged this, our conversation up on social media, it predictably had some very strong responses. Some of them were very negative, and I understand this, by the way, because say in France, Macron, the French president, has said he wants to create a French Islam. What does that mean? Well, it's an Islam that is privatized, has no public role at all, that is heavily curtailed, where you have the right secularist opinions about social values and political views, the right views about Palestine, you name it, is a really heavily managed state, top-down Islam that Muslims must, and there've been a couple of imams in Paris who preached the views in the khutbah, on the sermon on Friday, which the government objected to, and they've been removed. They were just quoting from the Quran and the Hadith. So there's a really quite authoritarian French Islam. So do we mean that? So we've got an English version of that. So it's heavily Britishize, or are we talking about? So if people get twitchy when we hear about that, then I quite see that. But there are other models. For example, well, you incarnate that in a way. So you have a British Islam that is at home in this country that recognizes urf. This is a term in Islamic law where the goodness of the social customs and practices that we see in Britain, whether it be the good food or the etiquette, the adab, the many traditions, even legal traditions, which embody justice. I saw this yesterday, which are completely compatible with Islamic practices, Islamic law. So, and it's a cultural thing. So, I have this kind of idea of the Imam after Friday cooked by going home and having a Yorkshire roast with his family and having fish and chips on Saturday, and even British humour, which I think is the best in the world, of course. So, of course, the kind of dry humour that some of us like and find funny even. So there are other models which are much more positive and are even recognized by Sharia as affirmed by Sharia. Anyway, I'm anticipating what you're going to say, but I just wanted to start the conversation up by saying there are different understandings of what we mean by British Islam or any country's Islam. Top down state creation, more indigenous, bottom up approaches. So would you care to elaborate your understandings of that, please?
Thank you, Paul. I think first thing to say, I mean, you give the example of France. One might say it's a contradiction that a state that espouses to be liberal and tolerant is anything but, right? That's the first thing we should probably highlight, and I know many people do that.
Yes.
Obviously, the British model is slightly different to the French. In terms of state. I mean, at least in terms of how we deal with people who are of different religious affiliations, etc., etc. So that's the first thing I would say, that we need to be cognizant that there is a glaringly obvious contradiction that's going on here, which is we're saying we're liberal and we're saying we're tolerant, etc., etc., liberté and everything else. But at the same time, we're telling you what you should be doing with your lives. And this feeds into the whole narrative about women covering themselves up and not covering themselves up and everything else. This is a whole conversation that we can have. But the British Islam that I would say it is not the one that you mentioned, which is a state down type, which is a top down version, which is that the state basically dictates to people how they should live their lives.
Yeah,
that is I mean, historically that never works when the state basically tells people how they should behave, because outwardly they may confirm, but inwardly they're not really content with that. So we should and Islamic history, if one reads it, Islamic civilization, they'll see that it was very organic, and Muslims always wherever they went, they became part of the fabric of that society. Whether you go to Indonesia, whether you go to Malaysia, you fly all the way across to the other side of the Mediterranean, you go to Morocco, Africa, and all the states within Africa, you see the differences there, but they're all unified by the unity of God, right? The Quran is essentially the same. They all read the same Quran. How they understand the Quran is a different conversation, but the Quran, the book itself, is the same. So theologically, they're all Muslims. In terms of how they practice their faith, and this is why you've talked about the concept of urf, which is custom, right? And Islam has within its legal system this built-in flexibility to recognize customs of other people. Just to give you one example of India, for example, when Muslims came to India, they did not, like other nations, come there and pillage India and then just leave. They became part of that society. They lived there. They built civilization there. They built an entire empire there, right? And they became deeply embedded within that society. So when Muslims go to places, it's not a case of going there and coming back. It's a case of going there and contributing. Even in art, right? Architecture, I mean, there's a book that we talked about where, St. Paul's Cathedral, which I visited just a few weeks ago. I mean, the dome, right? That's inspired by Muslim architecture. I mean, there was a cross-pollination of ideas. So this binary thinking of, there's only us and the West, right? Historically, it just doesn't work.
So what just to get to what is a British Islam, is assuming that the concept has legs, that it actually does have meaning, and it's not just some, because many of us in the West think Islam is an Arabic religion. So if you're Muslim, you've got to wear the headdress, women have to dress in a certain way, and you eat. How cultural is this, and what would a British Islam be in a positive way rather than the negative way that it's been forced on Muslims in France, and not only France, obviously other countries? What are we talking about? How would it look? How would it feel, do you think?
Yeah, I think the question before that we need to just deal with, in my view anyway, and this is my own understanding of the school of law that I follow, which is the Hanafi school of law, which is most dominant one as well, actually, in terms of numbers. Is that
just to clarify? Sorry, you mentioned the Hanafi. Who don't know what it is. In Islam, there are 4 schools of thought, and these are very, very central to how Islam is interpreted. And the Hanafi one, I understand, is the most popular, widely followed Sharia, understanding Sharia in the world, as it was in the Ottoman Empire, very popular with the Ottomans, of course. You're following the most commonly practiced understanding of Islamic law was. So I just wanted to labor the obvious in case people didn't.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Paul. So I'm just gonna, before I try to answer your question, I think it's really important for Muslims and non-Muslims to understand an important point, which is how theology and the law works within Islam, right? The interaction between theology and law works. Because I think if we don't get our epistemology correct, we're just going to be talking past each other.
Exactly.
So this is my understanding of how the Hanafi law works with a theology of Islam, if you like. Now, there is a tension, no doubt, between Islam as a universal and moral imperative, and Islam as a territorially based political identity, right? So what the Hanafi jurists have done, and they've done this, I believe, it's a masterful piece of art, in terms of how they've carved this out legally, is that wherever you are as a Muslim, you are still part of what I call a Darul Islam, in a metaphysical sense. You're still a Muslim. So even if you live in Britain, you're still a Muslim. So there's no contradiction. Just because you don't live in Mecca, or you don't live in Morocco or Pakistan, metaphysically, theologically speaking, you're still a Muslim. Right. So nobody can say British Muslims are somehow less Muslim than someone living in some Muslim country. Right.
Interesting.
And you're still part of the Ummah. You're still part of this concept of the community.
So the Ummah is a community, the global community of Muslims in the all of them around the world.
So this doesn't contravene Islam as a universal religion, right? So this provides a metaphysical or a theological solution. So that's the first thing that we need to be aware of, right? So you like the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that the whole world has been made a masjid. So wherever you are, you're still a masjid. So you're not really. And this goes back to, if I really want to go back to the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, if we look at how he migrated from the city of Mecca to Medina, that was a migration that he made. And so Muslims can look back at that even as a historical moment, which signifies a rich repository of meaning, right? Because the Prophet migrated to a non-Muslim, if you like, enclave, and then established, and even then, even when he began to live there, it wasn't about laws. It was just about the guidance from the revelation that we look at, the Quran that we look at there in Mecca and early Medina, was about basically values, morality, theology. It was less about laws. It was less about legislation. It was more about being metaphysically situated in a non-Muslim environment. So there's a lot of rich meaning that we can get from that as well. Now, legally, when Muslims live in places like Britain, for example, which legally we would classify Britain as Darul Harb, right? Which is, if you translate it, it's abode of war. But that doesn't mean you're fighting with the British, right? It's just a designation. It's a descriptive term. Anything where Islam is not the law of the land, is called Darul Harb, and then they have subcategories. The lawyers have subcategories. So we have a Darul Aman. Basically, we're living in Britain, and we have an agreement, if you like. We pay our taxes in return. The government does X, Y, and Z for us. We live in a democratic entity, in a secular society now, arguably. So we legally we are still Muslims, but many of the legal requirements from the Sharia would be rescinded, or would be less of a requirement for us, right? So, for example,
Yeah, sorry.
yeah.
You're
So,
going
for
to
example, and this ties down to another. Forgive me if I go into this too much, Paul, but I think
get.
this is really important because a lot of people can't see this, and they get into conversation without understanding. So, for example, we don't have minority discourse in the Hanafi school of law, right?
No,
They don't have this. So, this discourse we have of Muslims are a minority and so forth. It's just like, look, Muslims can live in a non-Muslim country, right? They're still Muslims. Legally, there's a relaxation of certain laws, and these laws are mostly to do with hukukul ibad, i.e., rights of people. So there's two types in Islam. There's rights of God, which
Yeah.
are always mobile. They're fixed in some ways, metaphysically, and they are individual. So, for example, the prayer. Wherever I am in the world,
Yeah.
I still have to pray
Yeah.
because that's a right of God. But when it comes to rights of people, because Islam or the religion appreciates this idea that you can only fulfill the rights of fellow human beings when you have Islamic government, because they're meant to be the most just, divinely revealed sort of religion. So because there's an absence of that, and they can't enforce it, right? You can't
Yeah.
have your rights fulfilled. There's an easing of laws pertaining to rights of fellow human beings. So, for example, when it comes to things around interest, for example, things to do with, I mean, interest obviously it's a problematic thing for Muslims, but the Hanafi scholars would say, at least classical scholars would say, well, there's a relaxation there, right? And other things as well. Yes, but the point here is that there's a relaxation there because these rights can't be fulfilled under a non-Muslim entity. It's not seen as a just entity. But
Right.
Muslims as an individual would still be, obliged to honor those things. So,
Right.
so in this world, nothing's going to happen to them. But when they stand before God, they'll be accountable. So there's two planes. So there
Right.
is with resisting the temptation of creating a secular religious binary here, there is an understanding of some sort, that there's this worldly and otherworldly consequences, right? So while you're living in Britain, certain things are not an obligation upon you because you're not living in a Muslim entity and you're not going to get the rights that you would have done. You're still morally, individually obliged before God to fulfill those obligations to the
Yeah.
best of your ability.
Yeah, of course. So to the examples would be in terms of what was permissible and impermissible in terms of sexual behavior, without going into details. The Islamic understanding is still there for Muslims, but of course, socially in Britain today, there are many more options are open to Muslims than there would be in Islamic society. But they're still accountable to God, even though politically, socially, there's no direction given. It's a free for all, really.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
And that's important. Like, so people talk about, Sharia law. Well, you can't have Sharia law in Britain.
No.
Quite simply, right? Because you need a whole empire, you need a whole state, you need a whole apparatus to ensure it's done properly. Otherwise, you have chaos, right? Then people will just take the law into their hands, and they won't go through the judge, and they will just do whatever they want. So it provides social stability. It provides, and it's consistent in its approach, and so that's the way I would look at it. There's a theological, metaphysical layer, and there's like a legal layer, if you like, which I find personally very, very useful living in Britain. And obviously there are very few things, as you know, Paul, which are compulsory for Muslims, which are what we call in probabilistic nature, qat'i, right? Like it's definitive. Everything else, much of Islamic legal discourse is it's into probability, which is zanniyat. So the prayer is farz, right? You have to pray 5 times a day, right? That's whether a Muslim does it or not is a different question, but the obligation is there, right? So that's fixed. But how many things are fixed in the Sharia, right? Very few, and that's God's mercy because it's not a religion that's burdensome. It's a mean. They have this golden mean, which is that it's not too onerous, but at the same time, if I can use the word, it's not too liberal, where it's just left to everyone's sort of own desires. But so there is a mean there, and then you have the flexibility. Clothing. So when you talk about clothing, we're not talking about physics. We're not talking about theology anymore. We're not really talking about law anymore. We're kind of, in terms of its importance, we're moving down the hierarchy, right? So I think a lot of these conversations around clothing and other things, they take account of the society that you live in, right? And the people that you live with. And so Muslims, historically, I mean, Islamic languages, it wasn't just Arabic, it was Persian, it was Urdu. These were the languages that you would study Islam with, right? Even in a scholarly elite circle. So this idea of languages, I mean, we needed Anglophone Islam, right? We need to develop, our scholarship in English, right, in a way that's accessible to people who speak English as their primary language.
Yes, I must say, I'm, as I'm sure we all are, some books translated into English from Arabic, for example, are pretty unreadable, and they're supposed to be for an English-speaking audience, and they're not fun to read at all, and they're very off-putting actually, and that really needs to change. But I mean, in my view, that in terms of a British British flavored, I don't know the way to put this, that there are a number of really important aspects that a British Muslim culture and presence in this country could contribute to the wider society. For example, the Islamic emphasis on stable, healthy family life, obviously a mother and a father and children, in terms of obedience, the discipline within families, the different roles and so on. These have a profound echo in British history, because we're looking here at traditional values, to be honest, looking at conservative social mores. Now, they're very unpopular at this moment, but they are part of 99% of British history. And we've lost, arguably, much of that now. And that's something that faith communities, not just Muslims, to be honest, but especially Muslims, have kept this understanding of family alive and well. And that's a really positive contribution, I think, to the wider society in terms of revivifying, bringing back ways of living which can really help reduce divorce and alienation and delinquency, and bring back healthy relationships. And that would be one of the ways I would see British Islam contributing positively to the wider British society. Do you agree with that, or?
Yeah, I mean, just before I answer that question, Paul, if I may, because I never got clarified, is when I talk about British Islam, I don't mean in a theological sense. I think that's clear by now.
Yes.
I mean it's descriptive sense.
Yes, absolutely. Can't imagine what you mean by British Islam in a theological sense. No, indeed. Yeah.
So that's important to clarify, lest some people might come running after me and say, oh, this person is inventing his own religion within Islam or something.
No, very good point.
So going to your question about, family value. I mean, my grandfather, when you were speaking, you reminded me of a conversation I had with my grandfather. He passed away a few years ago. May God have mercy on him. But he came here, many, many decades ago. And one day I was sat with him. This was when he began to lose his eyesight. And I had a conversation with him. I said, what was it like when you came to Britain, all those decades ago, to work here, to help rebuild Britain after the wars and the devastation that we had, experienced. And he said, I don't know if I've changed, or I don't know if the society that I came to has changed.
Wow.
And I said, which one do you think it is? He says, the world that we came to was very Christian. We had a lot of respect for our family. We had a lot of respect for our parents. And I don't see that in the wider British society. So, we were having this conversation on, well, Britain has really changed. Not so much Muslims as such. And so even Muslims who came here a few decades ago would say, well, the world has changed a lot. Even the religion, Christianity, the numbers are dropping, right? If you look at the statistics, which was a religion, it provided a social mores for society.
But you were saying, before we went on air, you were saying to me the churches in your area in Lancashire used to be full of people. People used to, leave the cotton mills, whatever, and then they used to go to church in big numbers. But now you were saying they're pretty much empty.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I must confess, I do attend a church every now and then just to meet friends, because I do have friends who are from the Christian tradition, obviously. And I mean, some churches are closed, basically. I mean, these are marvelous buildings. I mean, these are beautiful buildings just to look at. And the town that I live in at one time was one of the most wealthiest towns in the country. It was a powerhouse. It was an engine. Um, and now you look at these places, barely people go to churches. Numbers have dwindled. And this isn't the case with my town. I mean, whenever I do travel to other churches, historic ones in particular, and I do take note of the numbers because, like a colleague once said to me, a Christian colleague once said to me, he said, the amount of young imams that you have and the sort of the churning out of the imams and young scholars that you're producing, we would die for those numbers, right now. And I mean, the attendance you have in mosques, mosques are usually filled, and they're always increasing in numbers. I mean, we would die for those numbers.
Haroon, what I've noticed, I mean, it's obvious to anyone who's been to mosques, particularly on Friday, the day of prayer, when everyone hears the sermon and so on, is how young everyone is. I mean, this is something you do not normally ever see in a church. And I've been to lots of churches. There are some churches like HTB in London and Kensington, but these are exceptional. And that's why we know about them, because they have a lot of young people, but they're unusual. But the average mosque is packed full of young people, men and women. And that is a striking indication of how alive the faith is in Britain, how healthy it is, given that it's so many people following it, but also for the future, because the people who go to churches now usually tend to be, bless them, in their, I don't know, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and so within a generation, most churches in Britain, I would think, without being exaggerating, are going to close. But that's not going to be the case with the mosques.
Yeah. I mean, even if you look at the raw data, I mean, what's the population of Muslims? There are maybe 2.8 million Muslims, 4.4% of the population. And I think 48% or half the Muslims are under the age of 25.
Under the age of 25?
Under the age of 25, right? So half the Muslims are under the age of 25. And, young British Muslims will have accounted for a quarter of the growth in the UK's working age population between 2008 and 2018. So, these Muslims are very much part of society as well. And they have the youngest age profile of all religious groups, right? So these are raw statistics. So, if you want to take a tax perspective, they're going to be paying for a lot of pensions as well, right? In the future as well, for people who are aging. So the point here is that we do have a young population. My own experience, and I mean, the literature seems to be saying this, and my own anecdotal experience is there's a great thirst amongst young Muslims in Britain for seeking out a deeper understanding of their faith in the society that they live in. So the Muslims that I meet and that I work with don't see a contradiction between, going to university, a secular liberal environment perhaps, and going to mosque in between that, or going to pray in between that. They see them as compatible, and they see them as enriching experiences. And so that's very promising for many Muslims in Britain. And there's historical precedence for that, right? Muslims they feel comfortable in these intellectual or social environments. So that's promising developments.
But you say, Haroon, surely what should be happening, according to some sociologists and commentators, okay, you get Muslims coming in from India and Pakistan and so on, first generation, they're really strong in their faith, in their culture and religious identity. Second generation, and you get a progressive secularization. And like with the Christians, of course, then you will find that the second, third generation Muslims, like the Christians, will basically abandon their faith in all its essentials. They might have a vague kind of sense of, Easter or Christmas, something to do with Jesus, whatever, but basically they're secularized. But in my experience, very limited experience of Muslims in London and online, that doesn't seem to have happened with these young Muslims. And this shouldn't be happening. I mean, this is not what was predicted by the theorists, the social commentators, the sociologists. For some reason, the Muslims young Muslims are, and the faith they're retaining is not some kind of diluted, westernized, secularized Islam, which has a vague understanding of God, but basically we're all, we're all good secular liberals. No, it's a robust faith that believes in the core teachings of Islam. I mean, is that your observation as a imam?
Yeah. I mean, I use the word bricolage. It's come to me now, the word in French, bricolage. This idea of taking in, I mean, let's go back to the Quran, right? There's the verse in the Quran where God talks about the bee, the bee that takes, and I find that it's a very powerful descriptive way of how a Muslim is. A Muslim is like a bee, basically. And she goes around, and they take from different elements of the environment around them, and then they create something that's beneficial, but it's hard to pinpoint where it actually comes from, because it's a combination of different pollen, if you like, or different plants, if you like, and they've created this honey which is unique to that environment. So I find that example in the Quran very, very vivid and very fascinating. So I think the word bricolage is a useful word to use, because it kind of, it's very descriptive of how Muslims do it. There's another word which another sociologist use, which is fusion. So Muslims are in an act of fusion where they're bringing in different elements, whether that's in a secular environment, universities, or in their mosques, or in their study circles. So that's definitely happening, and my own experience seems to be saying that. My own research seems to be saying that, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Islam, Sunnism, orthodoxy. I mean, we can talk about the word orthodox at some other point, but Sunni orthodoxy has a robust intellectual framework which has, withstood centuries. Right? It's grown from the time of the Prophet into a whole civilizational idea, and it had empire with it. And despite the fact of what happened in terms of colonization, Sunnism maintained its position, right? Its core, it's not been destroyed, it's still there. There's this rich repertoire that Muslims can then benefit from and tap into, which is what I do daily. I mean, I read classical texts behind me all the time, but I'm also reading texts that are descriptive, that are just not normative but describing Islam.
I just want to say, sorry to interrupt, but it's really important that viewers know that you have a YouTube channel, which is a scandal that it's so undersubscribed. Dudes, you need to subscribe to Dr. Haroon Sidat's channel. Virtually every day, as you say, you are giving very intellectually rich commentary, reading from texts and so on. And I really strongly recommend people watch his videos because you're practicing what you're preaching. You're actually sharing this knowledge with a wider audience. And I've certainly bought some of the books, or been sent some of the books that you have featured on your channel. So I must link to your channel, your YouTube channel as well, so people can listen to that. And last night you were doing a live podcast with another chap whose name I forget. But there's a lot going on. Well, what you're doing, you really are putting into practice this. You're reaching out, sharing knowledge in a way that's accessible, I think. So anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, it's fine. That's perfect. Thank you. Yeah. So even my friend yesterday, Yasin, he is British born. Yeah. He has a degree. He's doing a PhD. He's absolute genius at mathematics, right, and logic. But he's learning Arabic. But he works for the government. I mean, he has a job within the state sector, right? So he doesn't see a contradiction being between Muslim and living in the West and so forth. So there are lots of people like this who are quite comfortable, and Muslims have done this for centuries. We are comfortable, living in China or India or wherever else it may be. And I always use the example of water. Muslims are like, Islam is like water, basically. Wherever it goes, it takes on a hue of that land, right? It takes on the color of that land, and water is beneficial. Water is something that benefits and allows things to grow and so forth. So Islam ought to be like that, right? And one of the things I find really fascinating in Islam is in terms of what its core is. It's very few. I mean, if you count them, there's 5 pillars of Islam, right? And one is the Shahada, which is just the testification or testifying that there's no God but the one God, and the Prophet Muhammad is the final messenger. Muslims obviously believe in all the prophets that have come: Jesus, Moses, peace be on all of them.
But Muslims believe in Jesus as a matter of faith, and they believe that he was the Messiah, excuse me, a prophet, that he was born of a Virgin Mary. So this is something that many Westerners don't realize, that how central Jesus is Muslim faith. So just want to
absolutely. And we're deeply insulted. I mean, we were having a conversation last week when people were when you see these cartoons of Jesus being mocked, that's deeply insulting to us.
Yeah.
We're deeply offended. But it's not about just drawing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. Any prophet that you draw cartoons about is deeply insulting to us, because they're prophets to us. They are divinely sent prophets. So the 5 pillars of Islam are very fascinating, because the first one is basically you testify, right? And you become, but it's a very individual act, but it's a very public thing, because once you testify, you become part of the ummah. So
Right.
you have rights, you have obligations. So although it's a very private thing, it's actually very public as well, because you're becoming part of the ummah. And you'll see this throughout the 5 pillars of Islam, right? That it's a private thing, but at the same time, it's public as well. So it evades this neat distinction between private and public. So
But can I disagree with you? Not just for the sake of disagreeing, but actually I do disagree. You say there's no contradiction between Muslim and living in the West. I have a good friend of mine, I won't say his name for obvious reasons. He's a GP. He's a young GP, probably in his late 20s now. A very bright man, but also a very committed Muslim. He's an Orthodox Sunni Muslim. He has a young family. And he shares in confidence with me his struggles to be a good doctor in practice in London, in several practices in London. And without obviously going into the details, but there is definitely a tension between what he is required now, increasingly, to say to people and opinions he is not allowed to voice. For example, again, this is controversial, but that's my point. He will meet people who come in, certain people who are engaging in very dangerous sexual practices, who have caught diseases or have physical damage done to them. And he can't in any way suggest that they might stop doing these dangerous practices because they're harmful to them. He can't say that. He's not allowed to say that. It's not, he doesn't want to, he can't. So he's got to prescribe this drug or that treatment, but he can't say, look, what you're doing, this particular act, is damaging to you. It's medically harmful. Now, I mentioned a specific example because it's not that he has a problem understanding what's right and wrong, what's good as a doctor. It's not that he doesn't know. He's not. If he was to say what is obvious, he could lose his job. If he speaks out on some of the issues to do with alternative sexualities and transgender and all that, which he is being told by the governing authority, he must have a certain view. This is not optional. If he was to speak out about this, he has a family. He would lose his job. He would be the victim of complaints. He would be hauled up in front of the BMA tribunal. Now, this isn't just a problem that Muslim doctors have. This is a problem that anyone will have, a traditional Catholic, traditional Jew, or even a traditional atheist, I suppose it's possible, who isn't going along with the ever-evolving and changing woke agenda, which really is becoming a very hands-on managed process where everyone is expected to perform. And Tim Winter, Abdul Hakim Murad at Cambridge University, has spoken about the problems that he faces at Cambridge in what he is required to say, what boxes he's required to tick endlessly. Oh, I'm supposed to agree with this, I'm supposed to agree with that, and it changes all the time. Now, a Muslim who has a set of beliefs based on revelation and based on the Sunnah or the Prophet can't go along with most of this stuff because it's simply against the teachings of Islam. So I would maintain, in disagreement with you, there are real contradictions, but not because it's Islam uniquely, but it's any traditional faith, including Islam, which has Orthodox Jews who their understanding comes from the Torah given to Moses and is very similar, in my view, to Islamic law. Very similar. They have the same problem, I would imagine. I mean, I don't actually know the Jewish doctors, but I would imagine they would do because it's common sense they would. So I would say that if we're too at home in the dunya, then there's a problem. But if we're too alienated from it, that's also a problem because we can't live here in peace. So there seems to be this uneasy tension that is inevitable in any faith-based life, which requires faith to take precedence in some way. But you can't express it because then the state would punish you basically by, well, you know all this. So that would be my response to what you said.
I would actually change my position and to somewhat to agree with you. There is always a tension. I mean, we as religious believers or people who are of this persuasion that you describe, do have these challenges because there's an hegemony, right? There's a hegemonic structure which imposes, while it says it's liberal and it's tolerant, it's anything but, right?
Anything but.
So one of the things that we try and do, some of us, is we try and expose the contradictions that are within this structure that says where we are tolerant and we love everyone and everybody's welcome. But if you say something we don't like, then we'll make sure that we send a mob after you. And and so that's a form of religion in some ways, right? It's a form of it's a very stubborn form of religion, which is unhealthy for our society. So I think the final, I think towards the end, Paul, you said something very interesting, which is that the believer has to work with this tension, which is a form of mujahada, which is a form of striving, right, with these tensions, because this world is not, I mean, the ulama would say, the scholars would say, this is darul imtihan. This is the world of tests, exams, examination. And so we are all in every instance, every interaction, every meeting, God's teaching us something and God's testing us. So how do we so the example of your friend who's a GP, I have a lot of friends who are GPs and they come to me with similar situations, right? Yeah, it's they are dealing with these tensions, and not just GPs. I mean, people working in many places as well. In the education sector, it's particularly interesting, right? And so we are being, each and every one of us, I would say each and everyone is being tested individually by God in different ways. And then we have to, as religious leaders or people who are in a position of influence, have to not give people black and white rules as such, but give people principles or values, but also etch that with a spiritual understanding of, this is a world of test, and you've got to try and do the best of a situation that you are in. We're not living in a utopian world. We're not going to get that until we reach paradise. I mean, that's the whole the fact that we crave for that, a utopian world, tells us that we have the Adamic or the Garden of Eden, which is a place of perfection, which is within each and every one of us, that we want a world which is perfect. And this world is not going to be perfect, but if we keep working towards, in our own individual ways, a world of some form of perfection where we're comfortable in ourselves, right? While there's all this chaos out there, we can at least get some sort of understanding of how to navigate these challenges. I don't think I would say that it's easy living in Britain. Not at all. I mean, there's times when I'm absolutely frightened for my daughters. 3 young daughters, Paul, growing up, in terms of what is it that I can give? What tools can I give them? So that when they go to university or they go out into the world, they can sort of hold their own. And the only thing I can do is give them a strong faith, a strong conviction,
that's right,
in what they believe in.
And I don't get how to navigate, how to negotiate these, because you can have that strong faith, but when you're then thrown out into you're going to university for the first time or into a job, you've got to know how to articulate that faith in ways which remain true to your own convictions, but also where you keep your job, basically. You can't just speak out and say, oh, well, I don't agree with this training. I'm required to go onto this course which says X and Y. Clearly, this is not supported by any traditional faith. Do I defy it and speak out, or refuse, or how do you? I'm not asking. It's a rhetorical question, but how do you navigate these impossible situations where you need a job, you've got to have a job, but you've got to go on these courses, or you're required to tick these boxes, like Tim Winter is, as a Muslim or a person of faith in Britain, but it's also in France and Germany, in the United States. And this is as you say, it's a test, it's a trial, but the people need these skills, these ways of navigating through these treacherous waters. Otherwise, if they go to one extreme or the other, they're going to hurt themselves, I guess.
And I think that's a challenge. You've touched upon something here, which is religious authority, religious guidance in the society that we live in. And one of the things I try and do personally, and I found very, very useful, is learning how to reason effectively. I'm not saying you should become a master logician, right? But just basic reasoning skills are very, very important. What I teaches you anyway. And then language, because Islamic civilization, one of its strengths, I believe, is language and rhetoric, right? How to use language and how to use words properly. And so when you're in these environments, how to do what's called tabligh, how to get what you want to say across in a way that's gonna make an impact on that person in a positive sense, right?
Yes.
So you're not being you're not being difficult, and you're not being someone who's gonna just cause difficulties for people, but actually you're being diplomatic, but actually you're getting your point across at the same time as well. I always give the example of saying a joke, right? You can say a joke
Yeah.
and you can make the room burst out with laughter, and you can say the same joke and everybody just stares at your face, right? It's how you say it, it's how you communicate
Yeah.
what you want to say, right?
I must come back to you on how to tell good jokes, by the way, because I didn't know you were skilled in this field. So maybe we'll do another video on how to tell good jokes without it falling flat on the face and embarrassing the hell out of yourself. So
yeah,
I've got you down for a session on how to tell good jokes. Thank
we
you.
can do that. We can do that, no problem. But I think that I mean, we all deal with that, and I think if you have some principles that are that what are central to your faith, these are things that are non-negotiable in my faith, in my system, and there are things around it which are circumstantial, which are fluid, based on political pragmatic optics, right? I mean, these are things that I will need to consider based on based on the time. And so, for example, you might be working in a hospital, and you're a male Muslim doctor. A woman comes in, it's an emergency. She's covered in blood, her life's at risk. Normally, the normative is what? That you don't touch someone who is a mahram, who's not for you to touch, right? But here, the principle is what? That saving life takes precedence.
The necessity,
Yes,
basically.
when you teach people these principles, Paul, I think they're very, very useful.
Absolutely.
And I try and do that in my lectures. And when I meet with people, I say, okay, this is a normative state. This is, I don't call it utopian, but I say this is a normative state of how we should live. But God is going to test us. So at sometimes, and God teaches that in the Quran. I mean, for example, the prayers are reduced when you're traveling. Fasting is made easy for you when you're traveling. The normative state is you pray. The normative state is you fast. But God says, well, there are situations where things are difficult for you. And so there, under God's mercy, it's made less for you, right? So I think a lot of times people just need to sit down with somebody and just work out what we call qawaid fiqhiyya, or maxims, just basic maxims and how they work, and say, okay, well, this is a normative, but today, Paul, because we're doing X, Y, and Z, and we need to save someone's life, or X, Y, and Z, this is not. We're gonna have to rescind this one for today.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to throw this out. It's an actual example, very, very controversial. Okay, I'm at work. I'm a Muslim man or Muslim a woman, and I get on really well with my non-Muslim colleagues. One of them, say a male colleague, is going to get married to another man, and he says to me, "Oh, well, are you invited to my wedding next week?" How do you respond to that? You say no, which you might do. I'm not saying you should. So do you go, oh my God, you're not doing that, are you? That's terrible. How could you possibly do something? Or do you go because you don't want to offend your good non-Muslim colleague? What do you do?
Yeah.
It's not a question, by the way. I'm just trying to give a specific example of something that will actually happen or has actually happened in modern Britain, where the expectation is if you don't go, the understanding is if you don't go along with the request, then you are a hater. I mean, literally the jargon that would be used. So do you lie and say, oh, I'm washing my hair that night, I'm service and I can't come? I mean, sorry to throw this at you, but how would you use these language skills, this logic, this kind of maximum approach to advise someone in that very sensitive position?
So one of my teachers, he always taught me that that whenever you come to these sticky situations, always present what Islamic view is. You're not enforcing them, you're just telling them this is what my view is on whatever it is, right? So the first thing I would do, depending on my relationship with that person, say I know them really well, we're good friends, we work together, we're in contact. So by then they probably know that as a Muslim, you don't believe in these things, right? So you can communicate them, first of all, that very clearly, like, look, I'm really happy for you, which is fine because they're not Muslim anyway, so the Sharia doesn't apply to them, right? If you like. So you can say to them, look, I'm really happy for you, and you do know that in my faith, this is something that we find Another option is you can tell them still what Islamic position is, because you're entitled to do that. To say, well, in our faith we don't believe, but I still think you're a great friend, but I'm not going to attend your wedding. I wish you all the best. We're still best friends. I'll probably send you a card or something. Okay. So what I do is I try and give people the principles, and then I give them a menu and say, okay, these are the options from what I understand based on revelation and my training, and then you make the decision.
Right. Okay. So you're treating people like adults who can think this thing through for themselves, rather than barking fatwas at them.
No.
I mean, not that fatwas are bad, but I'm saying, you're taking a responsibility as a citizen to negotiate these issues in British context. Yeah. Okay.
You're training people to think basically for themselves, because one of the dangers is that they just come to you for everything and anything. I mean, so I kid you not, a few months ago, someone WhatsApped me, and they asked me a question which has nothing to do with religion at all. Like, just, do you know of a I think he was asking me about hardware shop or something, computers or something, right? And I was like, we can't do this to people. People have to be able to think for themselves. Right?
Yeah.
You have to give them the tools. I mean, God's given you you're an intelligent human being, right? Use it, right? The mizan, right? This balance scale. So what I'm trying to say is that what I try and do, depending on my relationship with that person, of course, and most of my friends, I usually sit down and talk to them and say, okay, let's think this through. Rather than me giving you an answer, let me give you the options. Let me give you the reasoning, and how do you communicate your position to somebody while maintaining that relationship with them? And so that's really, really important.
Yeah, no, that's very good. Okay. We're nearly coming to the top of the hour, and at this point I usually say to my honored guests, perhaps we should conclude. But one of the things that you are doing at the moment, you have a book project that you're undertaking. So you're writing a book. I'm always interested to hear about that. So what is the book, and what's the project?
Yeah, so the book comes on the back of my PhD. It's a monograph. I have 2 more chapters to write and a conclusion chapter, but I've been awfully preoccupied with this paper that we can talk about on Darul Islam and Darul Harb and Jihad. So that's taken up the last 4 months of my life. Pretty much every evening in summer, I was writing that paper. But I'm hoping to start the book again. The book's about my PhD, which is looking at the formation of British Muslim religious leaders, ulama. So I'm asking the question around, why do young people go to these seminaries in a secular environment? Why do they want to learn about their faith? Young Muslims in great numbers, right? So that's the first question I'm asking. The second question is, what is their experience? What is their life like? So it's an ethnographic study. What's their life like in this place? What do they do in the morning? What do they eat? What do they talk about? What do they study? And so forth. And the third question is then, what do they do once they've graduated from these places? So, we don't have a structure where they would have become people who would have worked for the state, right? They are now going to different fields. So do all of them become imams, or do they become chaplains, or do they become entrepreneurs? So what do they do once they graduate? It's never been done in Britain to this level. And I'm hoping to get the book finished. It's an ambitious target, at least the first draft by the end of October.
So who is the intended readership of this book?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Paul. So it's not for Muslims per se, because most Muslims in Britain would know this tradition or familiar with this tradition. I'm primarily trying to write for non-Muslims who have an interest in Islam, number one. Number two, Islam in Britain particularly, and then people who are then interested in the training of religious leaders in Britain.
Now, will you be making any recommendations based on your observations about how the future will unfold?
Yeah, I mean, for me, being the optimist that I am, that I think it's a promising world. There's a lot of positive things that are happening in these seminaries. One of the things that I'm particularly focused on is the pastoral theology, which is this idea that there needs to be a reflection upon how young graduates in these seminaries can provide guidance to Muslims who are dealing with some of the things that we've talked about, whether it's atheism, personal issues, in a way that's theologically rooted and authentic, but that's pastorally sensitive. Because most Muslim scholars, they can tell you chapter verse of this book and that book. But the important thing is, how do you dispense that knowledge? How do you help people navigate some of the challenges that they are doing, which is theologically rooted? Because one of the things I don't want people to do is just to make up things as they go along and go with the times. It has to be done with full cognizance that this is what God has revealed, but this is my understanding, and this is how God would have wanted me to fulfill that obligation at this moment in time, given the circumstances that I'm in.
Well, that sounds extremely worthwhile project, actually. Okay, well, perhaps we'll draw it to a close here. Do you have any final words you wanted to share with the viewers about British Islam? Is it a thing, or anything at all in terms of what we've discussed?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Paul once again. I know we've been keeping in touch, and I've been very difficult to Paul. I do apologize in terms of getting a session together. I mean, I've just, but it's lovely to finally do this. Absolutely. I know we're in touch. It's lovely to keep in touch with you, and hope we can do that. Everybody else, you can get in touch with me the usual ways. I've really enjoyed this. It's a positive future for all of us, I think, if we keep working at it. And I hope to do more sessions with Paul in the near future, inshallah, God willing.
Yeah, thank you for all that. We mentioned before we went live this new book, that's just come out, A Culture of Ambiguity, an Alternative History of Islam. It's translated from the German. We're not sure if the writer Thomas Bauer is Muslim or not, but it really quite created a major impact intellectually in German Muslim and academic circles. And you've read this book, and you recommended some particular chapters that we might talk about. I won't go into this now, but there's some real meaty stuff out there that would be an absolute pleasure and privilege to talk with you about in the future on Blogging Theology, actually, because it's just good to get this knowledge out there. It's one of the purposes of this channel, is to share knowledge, not my knowledge, but the knowledge that's behind me in these books, your knowledge in your head and in your research and so on. So thank you so much, Dr. Haroon Sidat, for your time. And I know you're incredibly busy. Your house has been renovated, I think, or changed, altered as we speak. Hence earlier on, there was some work going on. And you're a very busy imam and scholar and family man and many other things. So thank you so much for giving us your time. And I really look forward to having you on again. So take care. Till next time.
Till next time. Thank you.